At the special company party, she looked me in the eye, raised her champagne glass as if toasting the end of something invisible, and, with a smile that was no longer mine, said, "I want to dance with my boss." My response was all I had left of me at that moment, a restrained, almost ironic smile, without apparent pain. I turned my back and left her there, under the golden lights of that ballroom, smiling at another man, believing she was moving forward, when, in fact, she was just beginning to fall. Her words sealed what had already been silently taking shape, with small signs I'd ignored. Between us, it was over. And the most painful thing was that there was no scandal, no shouting, no open crying. Just the end. Silent, cruel, discreet. An end that deserved more than the elegant emptiness of that background music. The pain of betrayal wasn't the shock. It was the clarity. The certainty that she hadn't chosen me for a long time. The party only served as a stage for the confirmation of what my instincts had been whispering for months. The delays, the uncomfortable silences, the mechanical touches. The woman who once embraced me with her entire body now barely touched my skin. The woman who laughed with me at every triviality now barely looked at me. The woman who said our home was all she wanted now wanted, to dance with her boss. That was what it was about. It was never just about the dance, or about him. It was about me being left. And her leaving without asking permission. That dance was the final choreography of a marriage that had long been buried, but which I insisted on keeping alive with artificial flowers and forced smiles. That night, I didn't just leave the party. I left everything. From a love that had silently exchanged me, from a life I believed we'd built together. From an illusion that blinded me. And the cruelest thing was the way she looked at me when I understood everything, as if she didn't owe me any more explanations. As if the betrayal was already complete, and I was the last to be warned. But I didn't scream, I didn't call her, I didn't humiliate myself. I just left. I got into the car, breathless, like someone swallowing shards of glass. I drove through the dark city streets like someone searching for new meaning on the same old path. And I never cried. Because there are pains that go beyond tears, they settle in, silently, and gradually erase us from within. The following week, she returned home as if nothing had happened. She left her purse on the couch, took off her shoes, and complained about the traffic. And I watched her as if I saw a stranger in my living room. Like someone who had invaded the body of the woman I once loved. I tried to hear some justification, but none came. I tried to find some trace of regret in her eyes, but I only saw indifference. Betrayal doesn't reside in a stolen kiss, nor in a surrendered body. True betrayal begins when the other person stops considering you a priority. And I, there, was just a spectator in the life she had already abandoned. The following days were a morbid theater of conveniences. We slept in the same bed, but she dreamed elsewhere. She sat at the table, but was already hungry for other company. I still washed her coffee cup, still asked how her day was, still tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, until I realized I was sacrificing myself for someone who no longer cared. And then I said, "You can go." With all the calm the pain allowed me. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't try to stay. He just nodded as if he'd already expected it. And he left. Lightly, perhaps relieved, as if he felt he'd made the right choice. But the world turns. And sometimes it spins too fast. She thought she was climbing. That this man, her boss, the object of her newfound charm, would be the ladder to something greater. She believed the easy words, the shallow promises, the compliments that came with disguised intentions. And for a time, perhaps, she even felt she had won. Meanwhile, I was immersed in the painful process of rebuilding myself. Of understanding who I was without her. Of starting over, from scratch, with the scars still raw. But the difference was that I didn't want to hide it. I wanted to feel. To feel until it hurt. And it did. But it passed. Time, that silent sculptor, was carving a version of me she'd never known. Stronger. lighter, freer. And when she finally realized the depth of the hole she'd dug within herself, I had already blossomed in another garden. One day, we crossed paths. Without warning, without a script. She saw me with another woman. Holding hands. Laughing. With that kind of tranquility that can't be taught, only found. And I saw her. Still. Static. With the empty look of someone who realized, too late, that she'd lost something she'd never find again. She tried to smile, but it wouldn't come. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She stood there, staring, as if time had stopped just so she could relive each wrong choice. In that moment, regret was no longer a theory. It was presence. It was weight. It was reality. And me? I just smiled respectfully. Because forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. But going back? No. Going back would be betraying myself again. And I had already promised myself, never again. Now I understand what I lost. That was all she could say, months later, when she sought me out for a final gesture of hope. But I, with a light heart and a peaceful soul, simply replied, I've forgiven, but I'm not going back. Who I am today no longer fits what we had. Each went their own way. She with the emptiness. I with the freedom of a sincere new beginning. But what she doesn't know, what no one knows, is what happened that night at the party, after I turned my back. What I saw. What I heard. What she said when she thought I was no longer there. The thing that would change everything if revealed. And that's where the story really begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful truth. Betrayal destroys, marks and transforms lives forever. Our goal is clear, show how thoughtless choices can cost you the love of your life. Get ready. What you're about to hear, it's not just a love story, it's a lesson for those who think they'll never lose. Take a deep breath. The story will begin. And she will leave you in silence. It was easy to like them. There was something in the way they looked at each other, the way they spoke to each other amidst the world's noise, as if they were a small, silent island surrounded by chaos. No one imagined that, years later, this couple so many envied for their lightness and complicity would become a story of absence, loss, and painful silences. But in the beginning, everything was different. And true. Her name was Emily. He, Michael. Two common names, two souls marked by different pasts, but with a common desire to build something worthwhile. They met by chance, in one of those unpretentious encounters on an autumn afternoon, when neither of them yet knew much about love, but knew well what they didn't want to repeat: empty promises, lies disguised as affection, hasty passions that died in the first winter. Emily came from an emotionally disorganized family, where love was always conditional, where silence spoke louder than any affection. Michael, on the other hand, grew up in a home of genuine affection, but where everything had to be earned with patience and perseverance. When their worlds collided, something between them clicked with a strange naturalness. The beginning was beautiful. Light, almost innocent. The long conversations, the Sunday walks, the simple and sincere dinners. Michael fell in love with her with the calm of someone watching an entire sunset. Emily let herself be loved slowly, hesitantly at first, but soon found herself surrendering to something she herself wasn't sure she deserved. He liked the way she frowned when she concentrated, the way she laughed softly watching old movies, the meticulous attention he paid to the silliest details of the house. She was enchanted by his protectiveness, by the comfortable silence that existed between them, by the way he looked at her even on days when she felt less than herself. The relationship blossomed there, in a delicate setting. There was no rush, no euphoria. There was construction. They moved in together after a year and a half of dating, in a small but meaningful apartment. Every piece of furniture chosen together, every plant placed in the right place, every photograph hanging on the wall was a silent promise of permanence. Michael was working as a data analyst at a tech company. He'd always been disciplined and methodical, but with a quiet sense of humor that diffused any tension. Emily had landed a position in the administrative department of an events company after a few uncertain years professionally. She was communicative, charismatic, and despite a subtle insecurity that sometimes paralyzed her, she was highly competent at what she did. They had different routines, but they always made time for each other. They had silly rituals that became sacred: pizza on Fridays, coffee on the porch on Sundays, movie nights under the blanket in winter. They lived with little, but seemed to have everything. And that's precisely where the danger lies. When everything seems so stable, so certain, it's easy to miss the small tremors that form beneath the surface. In the early years, the relationship was stable, without major conflicts. There was affection, respect, and, above all, admiration. Michael saw Emily with sincere eyes, and she, despite her inner doubts, trusted him in a way she'd never trusted anyone. But life has a strange way of testing what seems too solid. The pressures of work, the personal projects that never got off the ground, the silent fears neither of them could articulate accumulated like dust under a well-laid rug. Emily began to question her identity. She felt stagnant, that her life was too predictable. She began to look at herself with a certain frustration, and, without realizing it, began projecting this onto the relationship. Michael, in turn, was exhausted. Work demanded more of him each month, and even though he tried to maintain the same rituals as before, he could no longer be as emotionally present. But he tried. He tried every day. Communication between them, which had always been the foundation of their relationship, began to falter in small doses. An automatic, okay, nothing, when it clearly meant something. Emily withdrew into herself, and Michael, trying not to pressure her, retreated. The emotional distance grew like a crack in a freshly painted wall. But even so, there was still love. And that was what held everything together. The love, the memory of what they once were, the desire to be that way again. Michael believed they were just going through a phase. And maybe they were. Emily, on the other hand, began to miss something she couldn't even name. A strange emptiness, a longing to feel alive again. It was as if she were losing herself without understanding where to begin to find herself. She started hanging out more with co-workers, engaging in new projects, and seeking new insights into herself. Michael, believing this was healthy, supported her, even though he missed the moments that had previously been just the two of them. There was no jealousy between them. There was trust. Or at least, the illusion of it. Emily, increasingly involved in her personal quest, began to look outward as if seeking an answer that her inner self no longer offered. She began to be noticed by others, to hear compliments she hadn't heard in a long time, to feel special. And this, little by little, altered her perception of the relationship. Not that she stopped loving Michael. But she began to love him less. To doubt him more. And to forget to look at him with the same eyes as before. Michael noticed. Not explicitly, but through gestures. She no longer waited for him for dinner, no longer laughed at the same jokes, no longer hugged him in the morning with the same warmth. But he justified it all with fatigue, with routine, with life. He believed everything would soon return to normal. After all, couples go through phases, right? He was patient, and preferred to believe in the strength of the bond they'd built together. Emily, however, was already in a different rhythm. Faster, more restless. As if running from something she didn't yet have the courage to face. They still lived under the same roof, still shared the same bed, still talked. But the essence of the conversation had changed. Talking about the day had become monotonous. Touching, a habit. Laughing together, a memory. The company party had been scheduled for weeks. Emily mentioned the event with unusual enthusiasm. She talked about the details, the people who would attend, the decor. Michael, despite not being particularly fond of this kind of atmosphere, agreed to accompany her. He thought it could be good for both of them, a break from the routine. And he was right. He just hadn't imagined the kind of break she was looking for. That night, they dressed like the couple they still pretended to be. They arrived holding hands, smiling. They chatted with colleagues, toasted, danced. But there was something different in the air. Emily seemed more alive than she had in months. And Michael, instinctively, began to observe. A glance here, a gesture there. Nothing blatant. But enough to create that uneasiness in his chest. He didn't know what it was. But he knew something was changing. And fast. On the way home, she fell asleep in the car. Exhausted or relieved, he couldn't tell. He only knew that in that sudden silence, a universe of doubts was forming inside him. The feeling of losing someone who was still there. The anguish of not knowing where he'd gone wrong. The helplessness of loving someone who seemed to no longer see you. And it was there, at that steering wheel clutched in his hands, that he began to understand that something had broken. And that maybe, just maybe, there was no way to put it back together. Time passed. Small changes continued to happen. Emily became more distant. Michael became quieter. A couple no longer saw each other, even though they slept in the same place. And between silences and absences, a story was no longer being written. Still without explicit hurt. Still without revelations. But with an invisible pain that grew with each day. And no one knew, neither he nor she, that they were just a few steps away from a point of no return. From a moment that would change everything. From a decision that would seal the end. But for now, all that remained was doubt. What had changed? What was being hidden? And, most importantly, why, even when they love each other so much, do two hearts begin to beat in different directions? The night seemed normal, but there was a different weight in the air. Emily sat restless on the couch, staring out the open window, as if the wind could carry away the guilt growing inside her. Michael had arrived earlier, tired but willing to talk. He sensed something had been bothering him for a long time, something she'd avoided explaining. The silence between them, once comfortable, was now suffocating. He walked to the couch and sat beside her, but she didn't turn. For a few seconds, only the distant sound of the city filled the space. Then he said softly but firmly, as if he already knew the answer he was going to hear, "Do you still love me?" She took a deep breath, taking her time answering. "Of course I do," she said in a tone that didn't even convince herself. Michael closed his eyes, ran his hand over his face, and sighed. "Then why do I feel like I don't?" That was when she finally looked at him. And in that moment, he saw in her eyes what he'd feared for months, absence. Emily tried to speak, but her words came out fragmented. She said she was confused, that she felt lost, that she no longer knew who she was. He listened silently, trying to understand if there was still something to be saved there. But what hurt most wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say. He watched her, and deep down, he already knew what he was about to hear, he just didn't want to be the first to say it out loud. That day at the party, he began, staring straight ahead, "You wanted to dance with your boss. Remember?" She looked away. "It was just a joke," she replied. He laughed humorlessly. "Jokes don't break up marriages, Emily." She fell silent. And her silence confirmed everything. He stood up and began pacing, his breathing quickening. "I saw," he said suddenly, and his voice broke the air. She looked at him, surprised. "Saw what?" she asked, trying to remain calm. He turned and looked straight at her, his eyes teary but hard. "That night. After I left the party. I saw you." The world seemed to stop. Emily's face paled, and her hands trembled. You were there?" Michael nodded slowly. "I'd forgotten my coat, I came back for a few minutes. It was enough to see you laughing, dancing with him, his hands on your back, your face pressed against his. I stood there, hidden, watching you. I hoped it was just an impulse. But when I saw you kissing him, I knew we were over there. And the worst part is, you didn't even know I was there, watching the end of everything we'd built." She covered her face with her hands, as if to hide her shame. She tried to say something, but her voice faltered. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she murmured. "I didn't plan it, it was a mistake." Michael gave a bitter laugh. "A mistake is bumping into someone in the hallway, Emily. What you did was a choice." He pulled away, went to the window, and looked out, gasping for air. "You don't know what it's like to see the person you love giving themselves to another, without even hesitating. You don't know what it's like to have your heart broken and then have to go home pretending you didn't see anything. I spent weeks trying to believe I was wrong, that what I saw wasn't real. But the truth is, since that night, you weren't mine anymore." Emily approached him, touched his arm, but he drew back. "I was confused, Michael," she said through tears. "I felt invisible, alone, and when he looked at me, I let myself go. Not because I didn't love you, but because I no longer knew who I was. I lost myself." Michael turned, his eyes brimming with tears, and replied quietly but firmly, "You didn't lose yourself, Emily. You lost me. Because I loved you, even when you weren't the same anymore. I loved you when you started to pull away, when I realized something was wrong. I stayed. You left, still by my side." Her tears streamed down, but he was unmoved. The love still existed, but it was suffocated under the pain of everything that had been broken. She tried to justify herself, saying she didn't want to hurt him, that the kiss meant nothing, that everything had ended soon after. But every word she said only made it worse. "It meant nothing to you," he replied, "but it destroyed everything for me. I looked at you that night and realized that love doesn't die screaming, it dies silently, the moment one of us decides to betray what was promised." The room seemed smaller, denser. She stood crying, he remained silent, leaning against the window. Finally, Emily took a step forward. "I regretted it," she said with a trembling voice. "In that instant, I knew I'd lost something I'd never find again. I thought about telling you, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing you, of seeing you hate me." Michael looked at her and replied, "You lost me the moment you chose to lie. And I don't hate you, Emily. To hate would be to feel too much. And I don't want to feel anything anymore." The silence that followed was the heaviest it had ever been between them. Emily sobbed, begging him not to give up, telling him she could change, that she could fix it. But there was something in Michael that had already made up his mind. "I kept quiet because I wanted to see if you would have the courage to tell me," he said. "I hoped regret would overwhelm fear. I hoped you still respected me enough to confess. But you didn't. And that says it all." She fell to her knees, tears streaming uncontrollably. "I love you," she repeated between sobs. "I love you, and I hate myself for what I did." Michael bent down, looked at her, and replied with sad tenderness, "Love that destroys another isn't love, Emily. It's selfishness." They stood like that for a few seconds, staring at each other like two strangers who were once everything to each other. And then he stood, walked to the bedroom, and began grabbing some clothes from the suitcase. She stood up suddenly and ran to him. "Please, don't leave," she begged desperately. "We can try again, I'll do anything." He calmly closed the suitcase, looked at her one last time, and said, "I've tried alone for too long. Now you're the one who'll have to deal with what's left." She sank to the floor, lost, as the sound of the door closing echoed like the final period of a story she herself had torn apart. Michael left with his heart in pieces, but with a strange peace emerging amidst the pain. He had faced the moment he had avoided for so long. He had looked the truth in the eye. And though it hurt, he knew he deserved more than scraps of love. That night, Emily was alone for the first time in years. The apartment seemed bigger, cold, empty. She walked to the mirror and saw the reflection of someone she no longer recognized. She remembered everything they'd shared, the promises, the happy days, and felt the weight of losing something priceless. Michael, on the other hand, drove aimlessly, his hands firmly on the steering wheel, but tears fell silently. Not of anger, but of grief. Because love, when it ends like this, doesn't just die, it leaves scars that never fade. And in the middle of that night, each in their own corner, they understood something that no explanation could change: there are mistakes that are forgiven, but never undone. And theirs was one of those. Michael left the apartment with firm steps, but inside, it felt as if he were falling apart with every foot he took away from that door. He carried his bag in one hand, and in the other, he carried the weight of a love that had failed to be cared for by the one who swore to protect him. The silence of the street contrasted with the storm inside him. He stopped the car at the first corner, turned off the engine, and cried. He cried like someone mourning the death of someone who is still alive. It wasn't just any ending. It was the end of the story he believed would last forever. Except that one's forever is never enough when the other gives up halfway. In the days that followed, he disappeared. He moved into a small rented apartment, changed his phone number, blocked all social media, and took time off from work. He needed to find himself away from everything that reminded him of her. He needed to learn to breathe again without the air being heavy with memories. Emily, for her part, felt her world slowly collapsing. At first, she tried to fill the void with distractions. She cleaned the house, reorganized drawers, put on songs they both listened to, trying to bear the pain with nostalgia. But nothing filled it. His absence was physical, emotional, and moral. Every corner of the house screamed his name. The smell of the clothes he'd left behind, the pair of slippers forgotten in the bathroom, the fingerprints on the windows. And then came the sleepless nights. The tasteless meals. The sound of her own tears echoing in the silence of the now disintegrated home. She tried to reach him. She sent emails that were never answered, texts that went unanswered. She called and went straight to voicemail. He had disappeared, not out of revenge, but out of protection. And this indifference hurt more than any scream of rage. Time passed, slow and cruel. Michael returned to work months later, thinner, with a calm gaze and a different posture. Something in him had changed. There was a mature weariness in his eyes, a quiet firmness in every gesture. He didn't comment on what happened, didn't talk about her, didn't engage in conversations about love. But there was serenity. He spent his days in silence, focused, and little by little, he returned to his routine. He met new people. He rekindled old ties. Little by little, his heart healed, even with the scars still visible to those who looked closely. He wasn't in a rush to love again, but he didn't close himself off either. He simply let time decide. And that's how he met someone different. A discreet, soft-spoken woman who carried a similar pain in her eyes. She, too, had come from a betrayal. The two recognized each other without needing to say much. And it was in this silent exchange of mutual understanding that his life began to regain color. Emily, on the other hand, tried to move on. He tried to return to his former self. But he couldn't. Life without Michael always felt incomplete. He tried to reconnect with old friends, but many drifted away. Some out of loyalty to him, others out of inability to act. She became increasingly isolated, like a shadow of herself. The boss, with whom she had kissed that night, no longer even looked at her. Months later, he started a relationship with a new employee and didn't even bother to be discreet. Emily saw, with her own eyes, what it means to be just a disposable chapter in the story of someone who never intended to stay. She tried to pretend it didn't hurt, tried to put on a smile at social events, but deep down, it all felt empty. She began therapy, searching for meaning in books, writing letters she never sent. She tried to find a way back to herself, but always came up against the same truth: she had lost a rare man, and there was no going back. Years passed. One day, by chance, she saw Michael crossing the street with his new partner. They were holding hands, smiling as if time had stopped for them. He seemed calm, serene, at peace. And she, on the other side of the sidewalk, felt her chest tighten. It wasn't jealousy or envy anymore. It was pure pain. A pain that doesn't scream, but suffocates. She thought about calling him, but he didn't even see her. Or if he did, he pretended not to. Later, he tried again. He sent one last message, saying he now understood what he had lost. That he loved him, that he regretted every gesture, that he would trade everything for another chance. And, again, he received no response. But this time, not out of cruelty. Michael had read it. And understood. But there was nothing more to say. Silence was now the most honest response. One morning, Emily walked into a new coffee shop in town. It was a quiet place, with a few tables and a bookshelf where customers could check out or leave books. Leafing through one, she found a handwritten dedication, in a handwriting she would recognize anywhere. It was from Michael. It was his favorite book. In the dedication, he wrote, "For those who still believe in love, even after being destroyed by it. May pain transform you, but never embitter you." She sat there, clutching the book to her chest, her eyes welling with tears. She knew, in that moment, that he had loved deeply. But he had moved on. And she, perhaps, never would. Michael, for his part, moved on. He married his new partner. He didn't have a grand ceremony, just an intimate one, with close friends and family. He didn't post photos, he didn't make public speeches. But that day, he was happy. Truly happy. It wasn't a love like the previous one, it was a new love, built with more maturity, more silence, more peace. He no longer carried anger or resentment. He carried lessons learned. And, most of all, gratitude for having survived the pain without becoming bitter. Deep down, he knew Emily had been an important part of his story. But it was a closed part. He didn't wish her harm. He just didn't want to be a part of her life anymore. He was free, finally. And so, the paths that once crossed so intensely went in opposite directions. Emily, with the weight of unshakable choices. Michael, with the lightness of someone who chose to move forward, even after being destroyed. Because true forgiveness isn't about returning to the past, but about not allowing it to define the future. Now, we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Comment below. Your opinion is very important to us. And if you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Remember, betrayal may seem like a fleeting detour, but its effects can last a lifetime. It destroys trust, emotional foundations, and, most painfully, it destroys true love, often irreversibly. This channel does not condone any kind of cheating. Our mission is to show, through fictional stories, how devastating the real-life consequences are. Until the next story. And never forget, when love is true, it deserves to be protected, not tested.